the great country of Ireland. At 16, he was awarded one of the most prestigious science awards in the country. He attended MIT for a very short time, then joined a Y Combinator company called Automatic, which was sold less than a year later for $5 million. He has since founded Stripe, and he is with us here tonight. So everybody, let's give a big round of applause for Patrick Collison. Here we go. How's that? Yes, go ahead.
Cool.
That's the introduction you get at work every morning, right? When you come in, or not quite? It's like, Patrick's here.
I'm sure someday.
Well, like I said, we are. I specifically am just so excited to be able to have you here tonight. We had Steve Blank here a couple weeks ago, and I think Stripe is one of these companies that we're really going to be hearing a lot about over the next couple of years. So just really appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
So,
Glad to be here.
love to just start and talk a little bit about your background. Tell us a little bit about your family and where you're from, and kind of
Sure.
how you grew up.
So I grew up in Ireland. I guess it was a pretty standard Irish upbringing. Spent most of my life living in like this really rural part of Ireland. It was sort of surrounded by farms and fields and stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, this was kind of problematic when. So I remember we didn't get a computer for a long time, and even when we got a computer, it took a long time before we got internet access. And so I remember renting or borrowing books from the library to like read about the internet because we couldn't actually get the internet. And so there was like a period of about 2 years when I was reading these amazing books about the internet, and it sounded so futuristic. And then we got the internet, but the phone line didn't work very well, and so I remember like going to these bandwidth test sites, and I got like 0.5k a second, and so the workflow was to like have a book with you while you use the internet, because you go like read a page of your book, you'd like look up to see if the page had loaded, and chances are it hadn't, and
Sure.
you went back to the book. And then eventually for like the last I think 3 years we managed to get this satellite internet connection, because that was basically the only way to connect this like really rural part of Ireland to the internet. And that finally worked well, and that was like 512k broadband, but the latency was horrible because like the packets had to go like out into space and back down to Germany, and so you have like some SSH session, and like you press a key and like 2 seconds later it appears, but at least the bandwidth is good. So most of my childhood was sort of I played with Lego when I was really young, and then I sort of jumped straight to computers, and so most of my childhood was either misspent on Lego or computers.
Yeah, and when did you start really using computers or programming?
I picked up PHP, I guess like most of the world it seems, first, and I started that when I was 13.
Okay.
Yeah.
And tell me a little bit about your parents. Lily, Dennis, is that right?
That's right.
What were their professions? What did they do? And
so my mom originally trained as a microbiologist, and so I guess Ireland is, or at least was at the time when I grew up, sort of pretty traditional. And so when I was the first child, and so when I was born, Ireland being such a Catholic country, she was expected to leave her job and go raise her new kid. And so she has this like wonderful letter from her employer at the time, where it's congratulating her on her fine career and wishing her all the best, raising her kid in the future, before she'd like given any notice or anything like that. Just it was assumed that she would leave. And so she did anyway, I think in part because she was so pissed off by that letter. And then so she, I guess, stayed at home with me. And then I think it was like about 3 weeks after I was born, she started a company. And so I guess I was just like, I was that boring as a child.
Totally normal, yeah, the recovery period, most mothers.
I think that this just speaks to how unstimulating I must have been as a baby. So she started this corporate training company, and so basically like ISO 9000 or Six Sigma or all this kind of stuff. And that company's still going today, and it's very much not a Silicon Valley startup. It's been profitable every year since it was founded, and now I guess it's the same age as me, so I suppose 23 years later, I think it employs like 12 or 13 people.
Wow.
And that's my mom. And dad trained as an electrical engineer, and both my parents, again, sort of very rural Irish upbringing. They grew up on farms. Dad was one of the first kids in the family to go to college. He went to work for Dell, and then
in Ireland.
In Ireland, yeah. And then he decided, when I think I was about 5 or so, that he was going to go buy a hotel on the shores of this lake in the middle of Ireland, which is how we ended up in this dire internetless, languishing situation.
That wasn't one of the upgraded features at the hotel, I guess. There was no internet access there. Or
Yeah,
came later.
It was great. There was none of these like stupid pay $20 a night for Wi-Fi thing. It was just there was no internet.
And so you have two brothers. Your brother John, who works with you at Stripe, who
Mhm.
co-founded the company with you,
Yep.
and your brother Tommy. What? Just talk about your relationship with each other. And are you very similar? Are you very different? Are you?
Yeah, so John and I are pretty close in age.
Yeah.
We're 2 years apart. John's 2 years younger. I guess we were similar-ish growing up. I got more into programming sort of through school, and John was more into sort of math and chess and stuff. But I guess we were both sort of pretty nerdy. We both sort of read a lot, and we were pretty competitive actually. And so I think it was kind of helpful that I eventually sort of went away to college in the U.S. and spend some time away from home, because I think that sort of allowed us to develop apart a little bit. And then Tommy is 5 years younger than John, and he's the one who's actually going to be famous and well known in several years. And so I know maybe in 10 years' time people will
I think he's already famous.
People will stumble across this interview because they're like Googling Tommy Collison and just like Collison makes this turn up or something. He's had more Twitter followers than me since I think he was like 13 or something. So mostly it's just embarrassing.
So you grew up in this home, entrepreneurial home really, and by your mid-teens you start to enter these science contests and things like that. Tell me how that started. What was the motivation behind that, and
Yes.
what happened? Tell us how you did.
So this mostly came out of, well, I guess two things. One is this kind of science competition was very well known and fairly kind of prestigious within Ireland, and so it just got a lot of media attention and everything. So it was fairly obvious that you sort of would love to take part in it. And a lot of the winning projects that came out of it were actually very cool. A couple of years, or like when I was in primary school, which I guess means age 10 or so or something like that, a project won that was a much faster version of RSA, but some like fairly kind of significant cryptography research. And the girl who did that ended up going to work with Stephen Wolfram at Wolfram Research. And there were like a bunch of like pretty substantial mathematics breakthroughs, new theorems, and generally stuff that just like it didn't seem sort of any way kind of. I think some of these competitions, like for high school students and stuff, have a tendency to seem kind of like condescending or junior, or like you be patted on the head for like making your volcano model or something.
Sure.
And there was no sense of that.
Sounds like one of the U.S. ones.
So I've never been to any of those, but
you were doing cryptography. It's a word I can't even really pronounce very well, and we're doing the volcano. Yeah. We're screwed.
Well, so I was very taken with it anyway, and so when I got into programming, fairly quickly I started wondering if I could do anything for this. And after PHP, I tried to learn Java, and I remember spending like a year trying to learn Java and just finding it so miserable. And I basically concluded that I should do something else and not be a programmer. But then I think it was I stumbled across Python from some essay that somebody wrote, and then when I was like reading the Python mailing list or something, people were always referencing Lisp as the inspiration for a lot of things in Python, like map and reduce and whatever. And so I went and I looked into Lisp, and Lisp just seemed totally great. And so I started writing this. I started trying to implement the MSN Messenger protocol. MSN Messenger was basically the aim of Europe, and like all my friends were on MSN Messenger. And actually, the earlier versions of the MSN Messenger protocol were fairly straightforward. So I started implementing this, and then sort of I finally got to the point where you could actually like send messages to people, and sort of the project sort of was this little prototype thing was now a success. But now I had to sort of figure out what messages the program should actually send, and so that actually starts to become a pretty interesting problem. And so like the first version just had like it had a repertoire of sort of pre-programmed responses and just sort of picked those at random, and then you realize that like not everyone sort of immediately realizes that they're talking to a program, and they start to like engage it in conversation. And so I gave it a name. I called it Isaac, and then started like writing these heuristics to try to have it keep the conversation going for as long as possible. And and that just became this like really this totally fascinating thing. And so one of the, I'm sure a lot of you guys know of it, one of the sort of the big challenges in artificial intelligence has been the Turing test, where sort of you have some human who's able to correspond, through some terminal with both another human and a computer program. And the Turing test proposed by Alan Turing suggests that in the case of true artificial intelligence, one would not be able to discern which was the program, which was the program, which is the human. And so now with instant messaging, basically, you actually kind of, people didn't realize they were playing the Turing test, but you kind of had them playing the Turing test, and you're able to sort of implement this massively parallel Turing test. And so ended up writing these programs that sort of tried to learn from all the conversations that they were having and sort of go as far as they could. And so, built up this like enormous database from hundreds of thousands of conversations, and just basically went down that AI rabbit hole. And so some work around that was what I first entered into this competition, and that was like the first time that I really felt like I'd done something kind of remotely interesting in programming.
So in 2006, you applied to MIT. You attend MIT you attended your first semester, and at the time you and your brother start this company. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I went to MIT. I applied to MIT sort of when I still had a year and a half left in high school, so I ended up starting a year early. I actually came out to my first time ever in the US was I came to Stanford for the International Lisp Conference in 2005, and I was just it was like this really eye-opening moment where like there was this other world of American universities basically, and so that was in like June or something, and I decided basically then that I would just like apply to American schools, for the next year, which I guess was kind of outside the spec, but the worst that would happen is they'd reject you and you could just apply the next year or something, and so I did that, and it worked out, and so I started at MIT. But I was kind of a year behind, and I started when I was 17, and so I sort of felt like I just kind of had this spare year, and the Irish high school system is pretty bad in a lot of ways, but one thing that's good about it is that you sort of do 3 years, then this big exam, and then you have this optional gap year before you do sort of 2 years and then another exam. And that gap year is supposed to be a time where you can kind of explore other interests, or just like do some work experience in a career that you think you might want to pursue, or go travel the world, or whatever it is. And John, my younger brother, was kind of currently in this year, and so we both kind of had just lined up with sort of some spare time, and we decided that we might as well try to start a company because it seemed kind of interesting.
And he was how old?
He was 16.
Okay.
And so we started this company, and the basic idea was that we thought eBay was really cool in that sort of by providing kind of liquidity to use the items. It was just kind of and kind of exploiting that possibility for coordination. It was sort of making the world much more efficient. But obviously eBay just sucks. I apologize to any eBay.
It's okay, we're at AOL. We're not at eBay.
Yeah. I guess the more charitable way of saying it is something like, eBay's rate of improvement had slowed by 2006.
For the Americans in the room, means it sucked.
So we tried to build, or we decided to build sort of some better version of eBay. We didn't really have any terribly clear ideas of how to go about that, but we started working on some prototypes. And then we applied to Y Combinator, and what actually ended up happening is we merged with another company started by two guys, Harj and Kovir Tagar, who had built a student marketplace in the UK and kind of basically also wanted to build a better version of eBay. So the four of us came together in May of 2007 to work on Octomatic, and the goal was to build a better eBay.
And how did that, just tell us how that process came together? Was that something where after you met, because you applied to Y Combinator with this original idea, and then was it something where Paul was like, hey, you got to meet these other two guys, or how did it work?
He basically suggested that we talk to them and sort of figure out if there was any ways in which we could work together, and like pretty rapidly after meeting we decided that it made sense to work together. And they had sort of spent a long time working on this. They successfully launched this marketplace, and we really felt that sort of they had a very good understanding of it, and we liked the idea of working with them. They seemed pretty good. And actually now Harj is a partner at Y Combinator.
Sure. Yeah. And so you went through the Y Combinator program. You guys moved here?
That's right. We moved out here, and we got this like small little apartment in San Francisco, and went to work basically. and that was sort of really that was my first time sort of spending any significant amount of time on the West Coast and sort of learning how like startups worked, and like really Automatic was just like this incredibly sort of foreshortened introduction to like startup land. It was like this whirlwind tour, and that came out, and sort of we started working on this product. We raised some money from angel investors. We launched the product. It did reasonably well, and people liked it, and then it was acquired, and like all of that happened sort of from incorporation to acquisition in like 10 months. And so Automatic never left sort of a huge mark on the world, but it was an incredible learning experience.
I mean, you guys, and I mean, it was big news because you and your brother were so young, right? And I mean, you were all over the UK. I mean, there was just a ton of press. Did you feel, how did it feel coming out of that? Did you feel like this? How did it feel?
To be honest, I always felt it was a little bit misplaced in that, I mean, there was a great sort of learning experience for us. I don't think that Automatic ever, it was a great learning experience, but it never sort of left any huge mark on the world. And so, I don't know, I've never been sort of all that enthusiastic with sort of it being interesting simply because we were so young. I mean, I don't know. I feel like we're sort of very lucky where sort of circumstances aligned, and like I'd been out here and I sort of knew Paul a little bit through Lisp and stuff, where sort of we managed to go through Y Combinator and sort of things worked out. But I don't think we did anything all that special.
And so you sell the company, and did you move to Canada to actually be a part of the company?
Yeah. So I moved and became the director of engineering for the acquiring company, and spent about a year in Canada.
Okay. And so you spend a year in Canada. Your brother goes back to school, right?
He went back and he finished school in Ireland, and we're kind of lucky, and this kind of gets back to the competitive aspect in that I actually did this in order to graduate early to start college. I did the British sort of leaving school exams, the A-levels, and he did the Irish ones, and so we sort of never competed head to head, which was kind of lucky for me because he ended up getting the highest score in history in these exams.
Wow. This really sucks. So you go through this next year. You're working as director of engineering. Mm-hmm. He goes to Harvard,
yep.
Right? And then you're talking this whole time? Are you saying, hey, okay, we're gonna, what's the next thing? What are we gonna do? Or where is your head at that point? You're not gonna stay in Canada forever. I'm sure. So. Right.
Yeah, we sort of. I mean, obviously, kind of kept in touch and everything, and then I decided to go back to MIT because I sort of, I felt like this, I was going to the end of this kind of 1 year experiment, right? From looking at what it would be like to start a company, and I guess neither of us were kind of sure that we didn't want to sort of go down the academic route. Like maybe we should try to become professors or something, and so I went back to MIT. John was at Harvard, and we just had some side projects going on the side. I think the one that was most fun to work on was when the iPhone came out. There was no SDK initially, but I was walking down actually the street in Vancouver with my friend, and we sort of realized that the iPhone was actually powerful enough and had enough storage space that you could store a complete copy of Wikipedia on the iPhone, and so you could basically actually implement like the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and so I think it was December of 2007. My friend managed to get like a working kind of jailbroken iPhone toolchain, so like this hacked version of like GCC that could cross compile to ARM on the iPhone, and he just like wrote some header files, kind of guessing the method signatures of the UI kit selectors, and he sort of showed me at like 3 a.m. one morning, like a working Hello World app on the iPhone, and this was back when Apple still maintained that there were only going to be web apps, and only like the apps that were actually built internally at Apple, they were sort of the only native apps that would be allowed to run on the iPhone. But so this friend, Brian, who now actually works with Stripe, he got this toolchain running, and so we decided to like try to build this Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy app. And this was just like a ton of time, staring at ARM disassembly and everything, but it finally worked, and we released it, and it was terrible because we hosted the Wikipedia dumps ourselves, and so it ended up getting like a ton of downloads, and each one was 2 gigs, and so there was basically like I was hosting it on SliceHost, and there was this like overflow on SliceHost where like it just couldn't show me how much bandwidth was actually being consumed. But the project as a whole was pretty fun. I think it ended up getting like a couple 100,000 installs on the iPhone, again back before the App
Wow.
Store, and then it was actually ported to the $100 laptop, like the OLPC, because
Sure.
these are being shipped to like
Everywhere.
Peru and India, whatever.
Yeah.
And obviously most of these people don't actually have internet access, and so this is kind of how you can read Wikipedia without it.
That's really cool.
So anyway, we're sort of, John and I were kind of working on side projects like this, and somewhere along the way, Stripe came along.
Yeah. So just tell us a little bit about that. So you're implementing. You're trying to actually solve. You solve this problem yourself, right? You're actually implementing merchant accounts and like trying to set up payments on one of these projects, or how did it come about?
So actually, what happened is, so one of the projects that I'd worked on back a few years previously was just trying to build a better web framework in Lisp, and I guess I was right that better web frameworks are interesting, but I was very wrong in thinking that like anyone would use Lisp. But I guess sort of by 2009 or 10 or whatever it was, we'd both sort of build tons of web applications, but we'd never charge for any of them. Like we literally never charged for any of the software that we'd built on the web. And we started sort of wondering why that was. And we sort of looked back and we realized that we'd actually sort of started applying for merchant accounts at like various points, or we'd sort of like taken the first steps for like integrating with PayPal, but just it never quite been sort of the biggest priority at any one time, and just the net result is that we had never sort of taken a single payment on the web. And yet we were sort of really taken with what was kind of happening in other industries, where there were these kind of very developer-oriented services coming along and sort of building these really nice abstraction layers over sort of some particular piece of infrastructure, just making it really easy to go and do something. So the obvious examples are things like Linode or SliceHost or EC2 for hosting, also obviously Twilio for telephony, just like a lot of these companies. And so I think it was October of 2009 or something, we sort of had this idea that maybe it would be kind of interesting to build a SliceHost for payments, and that's how we thought of it. It was a SliceHost for payments. I guess a bunch of you have probably like used some of these hosting providers, but at the time EC2 was still sort of very bare bones, and there wasn't really much of a web interface, and it was like you had to use all these command line tools to administer it. Whereas SliceHost had this like really nice slick GUI where you could just start, like you could like click build server, and like 60 seconds later you'd have a server. And we sort of wanted that like magical instantaneous experience for payments.
Sure. And so Paul Graham has talked about, used you guys as this example of really attacking very, very difficult problems, and people that he uses comparison of how many like recipe websites he's gotten, how many pitches he's gotten over the years versus no one ever pitched this idea. So, and because it was so big, it was you're solving such a huge problem. Where did you even start? I mean, where does something like that even begin?
So we didn't really know where to start, and like I definitely wouldn't pretend that we did. And
I mean, I would have started by like crying in the fetal position or something. I mean, it's like, did you? It's just you and your brother,
yeah,
right?
So basically, we faked it. So what we did was we decided to go on holiday and just like go hack somewhere. And maybe I don't know how to pronounce his name, but there's this guy Maciej, and I'm gonna totally like mess
He
up
may be
his-
here, so.
Yeah, I'm gonna totally mess up his surname, but it's something like Sidlowski or Chidlowski or something like that. I apologize, Maciej, if you ever see this. His website is idlewords.com, and he's a really good writer, and he wrote this series of blog posts about Buenos Aires and how it's like the best place ever to go and hack because it's really cheap and everything's open really late and there's like Wi-Fi everywhere and the climate's really nice and everything. And so John and I were facing this winter in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is definitely not like that in basically any respect. And so we decided to go to Buenos Aires and just like hack all day in cafes on trying to build a prototype here. And so we did that, and it turns out to be basically exactly as described. And so if ever like you just want to go and like work on something sort of single-mindedly for a month, I cannot recommend Buenos Aires more highly. We spent like $10 a day, and the weather was gorgeous. And like bizarrely, all of the cafes have Wi-Fi for no reason that I can discern, like much more than is the extent here. All the restaurants open really late, in that we were turned away from restaurants at like 9 o'clock in the evening because it was too early. all the bars are open until like 5 a.m. People only start going to bars at 2 a.m. and nobody gets up before midday. And so basically, it's like an entire city on a hacker schedule. And we were like the worst tourists ever in that I still have not seen like a single site or anything in Buenos Aires. We just like got up, went to a cafe, and like hiked all day. And at the end of that, we had the first prototype of Stripe.
After a month.
After a month, or I guess we had the first production user actually about a week after going to Buenos Aires. And what we did was we just like called up a friend who worked at a payment processing company and said, is it okay if we just kind of send a couple of accounts your way? And we sort of built sort of this really nice kind of this nice API and sort of interface for setting up accounts or whatever. And then when you sort of clicked create account or whatever, rather than an account actually being created sort of in the financial infrastructure, however that worked, we had no idea. We just like went and called our friend, which scaled to at least a couple of users. And so we
and you set it up all manually behind the scenes.
Yeah, this was totally manual. And I mean, at this point, like we had literally 2 users, and both of them were like good friends of ours. And so Paul Buchheit has this great story about building Gmail, where like he kind of repurposed the Google Groups code, which predates Gmail, to build Gmail. And so like he built the first working prototype in an afternoon, and it just it loaded all of his email into like the Google Groups interface, and he could kind of browse in the Google Groups interface. And he like showed his friends, and they were like clicking through it, and they're like, "Oh, this is great, but it would be really awesome if instead of viewing your email, I could view mine." And it was this like very kind of direct user request-driven development. And it was sort of similar to this with Stripe in that we sort of like built the API that allows you to charge credit cards, and so went on user requests from there. And so Ross Boucher was actually the very first user of Stripe. He was at a company called 280 North at the time, and he's like, this API is great, but what would be really awesome is if you actually transfer the money into my bank account after I charge credit cards. We're like, right, fair. And similar requests like this. And so.
So what it didn't go anywhere? Because I thought you were setting this up on the back end for him, or no?
Yeah, I can't remember.
It's all fuzzy math at this point.
But it was very much driven by basically what things they bugged us to build.
Sure.
And so we launched this prototype, and again I sort of the strength.
You're not back from Argentina, or
so by the time we got back from Argentina at the end of January, sort of the product existed, and it actually existed in sort of fairly close form to what Stripe is today. Like just this really simple notion that you can go to a website, like by filling it in a really minimal amount of information, you can start accepting credit cards immediately on the internet. And the fundamental idea is that it should be possible to launch a website and accept payments on it within like 30 minutes. And, before Stripe was, this multi-day.
Yeah, it's weird. Yeah, it's 5-7 business days, right, something.
Right. And I mean that's when sort of it got hard, right? Because kind of figuring out what the sort of software side of Stripe should look like. I mean, you can kind of imagine it, but then like, how do you possibly reconcile all of that with like the financial infrastructure and merchant accounts and gateways and laws and PCI and they're just like the words we knew. And so we went back to school and we sort of finished the next semester, and we decided to work on it out in Palo Alto over the next summer. And I guess that's when we started working full time on Stripe. I guess about a year and a half ago.
Okay, and yeah, I mean, so for some background, I'm sure a lot of people in this room or have dealt with this, but one of my first startup job in college was like signing up or like servicing merchant accounts, and it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it was like $2,000 up front to set it up, and it was like another 100 or something a month.
Yep.
And then the fees kicked in.
Yep.
And so it was just like for a small business.
Yeah.
It was insane. I mean, it was absolutely insane.
Yeah. The fee schedules for many of our competitors run to like more than one page.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, like, I think every now and again you just stumble across an industry that, like the online payments industry was just like an unusually compelling example, I think, of an entire industry that is going to have its lunch eaten. And whether that is Stripe or something else, like just this is not how the world should work. And yeah, I think I think it'll be very good for the world when fee schedules no longer run to 2 pages.
So you come back, you finish your semester of school, you come back here at the beginning of the summer 2010.
10. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
and so it's still just you and your brother.
Mhm.
And then what is the next series of events? You reach out to to Paul in that
Yeah.
team, or are you still just kind of building on your own, or?
So I guess two things happened. One is, I guess like a lot of startups, we at this point actually still looked at Stripe as very much kind of a side project, in that we were also working on these iPhone apps and whatever, and just like Stripe was another sort of like interesting thing we had going on the side. And but that changed over that summer. And what sort of changed was we thought more about, I guess we just thought more about sort of the problem of transactions and the internet, and more about sort of the internet in general, like what kind of things are holding the internet back. And it sort of struck us that sort of like you think of Google as really kind of solving the problem of like search on the internet, and like if you think of search on the web, you know, it's very clear that sort of we should have a good solution to search on the web, and you know, Google does a reasonable job. But you know, maybe you could do better than Google, but there's a pretty solid start at least. And similarly, you think of like social and the web, and you know, again, say Facebook, you know, perhaps we can do something better, but you know, pretty good job. And then if you look at sort of just payments, or even more generally, kind of like the economic foundation of the web, it's really shaky, and there's just like nothing there. And I mean, like PayPal to some degree, I think, was at one point on a kind of trajectory to build this, but they've kind of, you know, they never really got there. And I mean, it took us a long time to realize this. It took us kind of 6 months, but I think that's actually a really big deal, in that I mean, the web and the internet are still very young, but sort of all the things we buy, and sort of all the transactions we engage in, still only like a minuscule fraction of those happen on the internet. And like when you think about it, it's just like really hard to buy something on the internet today. Like it's crazy how kind of manual it is. You're like punching your credit card number digit by digit, and
Sure.
go to these multi-stage checkout processes. It's incredibly hard to start accepting payments online. Even if you start accepting payments online, it's really hard to transact across borders. In that, I mean, if you have a credit card, I mean, that's great. You can buy from a U.S. user, but I mean, good luck buying from somebody in, you know, like in Russia or China or Brazil or whatever it is. Similarly, if you're a consumer, like, I mean, if you're an American, you can buy from other American websites, but if you're like a Guatemalan or an Indonesian, I mean, you have to like, you're restricted to like your small little market. And I don't think this is kind of going to remain the case, in that I think that like there will be and there should be sort of like a really robust, reliable, simple, straightforward, powerful like economic layer for the internet. And sort of whether or not Stripe builds that, I think that, you know, we sort of realized that at least the problem space is pretty interesting and pretty meaningful, and so but we were kind of coming at it very much from this this, you know, fairly this kind of humble beginning of like, you know, building Slicehouse but for payments. We at least became convinced that there's something there, like this might be a somewhat rich theme.
Well, and what's interesting too is that you didn't start out, you know, you and John didn't sit down and say, you know what, we're going to build a payment platform, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it actually sounds like you were doing some of these other side projects that were more interesting to you because you're spending more time on it, they were more fun.
Mm-hmm.
And then as you continued to think about it as it evolved over time, over a
Yes.
span of 6 or 8 months,
Yes.
it was like, wow, actually, this thing we created has real potential.
Yes.
And this kind of leads into something I want to talk to you about, because we constantly hear, like, you know, Paul constantly talks about work on big problems.
Mm-hmm.
People also talk about work on something you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder, you know, is payments something you're passionate about? I mean, is it?
Absolutely. Yes.
It is.
Yes. I mean, I think that it's so, like it's the fundamental enabler, as in you're enabling people to make a livelihood, to like get into business. And I think there are actually very few things that are sort of as fundamentally kind of interesting as that. And I mean, I think the payments sort of at its core is pretty interesting and meaningful, but I think like especially on the internet, because like in a lot of ways, like, you know, many classes of payments are sort of a pre-solved problem, and so like there are tons of people sort of competing with, you know, what's the next way of like buying a cup of coffee at Starbucks, and like Starbucks is a mobile app that allows you to, you know, pay for your coffee, and Google are doing Google Wallet, and like there's all this NFC stuff, and like, you know, probably in 10 years I will not hand my credit card to the cashier, I'll do something else, but fundamentally, like, I'll buy my cup of coffee at Starbucks. Whereas on the internet, a lot of the transactions that are going to happen sort of they've still to be defined. We
Sure.
still don't really know what's possible and like what things can be built. And to the extent that we sort of make the experience of sort of transacting on the internet better, that just means all this new stuff will be created. And so if we build like the better way of buying up a coffee at Starbucks, the world I think will still look basically the same. Whereas on the internet, when you solve this problem, I think we'll actually have a pretty different internet. And so I think it's I'm not sure. Like, it's not immediately obvious to me what a more interesting problem to solve in the internet would be.
And you've made this comment that 10 years from now, the things that will be accepting payments, it's new things. It's not, the majority of the payments that are coming, it's not going to be on what we're using today. It's going to be on something new. And so you're basically creating the infrastructure and creating the platform for that. Is that right?
That's the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, so you come back to Silicon Valley. You finally say, okay, we're going to focus on this thing. And then what happened? What happened after that?
So then, I mean, by and large, we like set out keyboards and like typed, and like 99.9% of the time was spent doing that. And I guess by the time the summer started, we had a waiting list of, I can't remember how many people, but like some number of thousand people.
And this is just spreading. How do you get 1,000 people?
Word of mouth.
Word of mouth. You have a website that has a sign up page. Put your email here,
exactly.
Or we'll email
so,
you
like,
when it's
friends
ready.
that told other friends and this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But we couldn't have them use Stripe because I guess told you sort of how the account creation process actually happened in the background.
Sure.
And so we sort of like convinced ourselves that there might be something interesting here, but now we had to sort of actually go and build the infrastructure to make it work. And so we decided at the end of that summer that we would sort of go and take this seriously. We'd go and build that infrastructure and figure out whatever it is that we need to learn, and actually launch it properly. And so we took some investment. Y Combinator, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk, Sequoia, and Andreessen Horowitz, and a few others invested in our seed round.
Anybody we've heard of?
And then we basically spent the next, I think it was 14 months, building the infrastructure that could actually make this work. So from like August 2010 to the end of September 2011, it was like building infrastructure, and then we finally launched it to the public. I think it was the 30th of September. So
2011.
2011. So like just over 6 months ago.
So walking back to that point of raising, tell us how did those types of conversations start? So you already know Paul, they've invested in you. Some of these maybe were some of your previous investors, but you go and you meet with Peter Thiel, and what happens? Is it walk us through your first meeting with Peter Thiel?
So I remember being very critical of PayPal, and then sort of halfway through the meeting being like, maybe not the best strategy.
Wrong deck.
Right. Mostly I remember him thinking that a lot of the things we were doing that I thought were a bad idea, him thinking they were a good idea, and sort of vice versa. And that being sort of pretty interesting. And so at the time, we sort of wanted to have this forcing function that to sort of encourage us to make the product really good. And so we charged 5% plus 30 cents for every transaction, which is like way more than anyone else charged to process online payments. And sort of our thinking was that, well, we don't want anyone to use us like because of the cost, and so rather than try to be even competitive, we just price it like way higher than everyone else, and kind of until people were willing to use it and like pay that large premium, the product sort of wasn't sufficiently better. But we didn't really think of it as sort of like a viable long-term strategy. And I remember Peter arguing that it quite possibly could be, and that that could be like a really interesting business model.
Yeah, basically you'd provide a better customer service, better experience,
right.
And you could charge a premium
and
for
just kind of have a fundamentally different business model to like every other payments company. And I guess I also remember Peter being just like smart and decisive, and so within like 2 hours of meeting, he had agreed to invest. And we did like tons of other meetings, and like lots of people had told us that like this was not even possible, or like the million reasons we would fail, whereas Peter pretty emphatically was like, okay, I will invest. And I think that I think really changed our trajectory.
And so you also took Y Combinator money, but you didn't go through the program again. You'd been through it, right? And
That's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, we I guess Octomatic had gone through Y Combinator, and Stripe sort of already existed, and I guess we for no particularly good reason actually we didn't end up going through the program again. Like I think kind of if I were to go back and look at that decision again, it would be kind of 50-50 as to whether or not we should. But yeah, we didn't go through it that way.
Can you talk about what are some of the? I mean, Y Combinator. It's clear they provide financing. There's some mentorship there, but what are the, as somebody that's now been a part of 2 companies that have been invested through that program?
Yep.
What are some of the tangible benefits that people get from, or intangible benefits
Right.
that you wouldn't think about they get through going through Y Combinator?
So there's a bunch of them. I think that, like, for us, one thing that was really valuable was having all these alumni and just being part of this network of other startups. I mean, we were building a service that, whose initial users at least included a bunch of other startups. And so having kind of all these other people who we knew that were building startups, and being able to say to them, oh, you guys should use Stripe, instead of having them want to help us because we're a fellow Y Combinator company, I mean, that was just super valuable for us. In that basically other Y Combinator users were our users, and I think maybe our first 10 or 20 users were all YC companies. So that was really helpful. I guess, I presume, like many, if not most of the people here have startups themselves, and it turns out that startups are really hard. And just like having a bunch of other people around you who are sort of doing the same thing and like get that, I think is really, really nice and valuable. But actually, I think that Y Combinator talk quite a bit about, I think more than most sort of similar incubators or whatever you call that class of like seed funding entities. I think that they talk sort of more than most about what their value is and what they do, and they have actually this like really detailed document on the YC site describing just like what YC is and what you do. And they talk about sort of some of the benefits, like that they have a ton of data, like they see hundreds of companies, and so they can just kind of apply sort of aggregated other companies' experience to your experience and just sort of provide helpful data-driven advice in that way, or the alumni network or whatever it is. But I feel like YC can't actually sort of kind of, it's difficult for them to talk about the biggest advantage of YC, which is simply that Paul and their partners are really smart. And I feel like they can't really sort of write this document that sort of, you should do YC because we're really smart. But I think it's actually kind of the best reason to do YC, in that like Paul initially and the other partners, and now the other partners who've joined, are just really, really, really good. And I mean, I guess with Stripe we've been kind of lucky where we got to, or like do get to work with like lots of good investors, but like there's no question that YC are at the like very top tier.
And when you say good and smart, are you talking about like product feedback or execution or technology, or
right.
what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, so there was this like about a month ago or something, there was this meme going around Facebook of like what my mom thinks I do and like what my friends think I do and like whatever else for like all these different professions.
Yeah.
And I feel like the world thinks startup founders are like thinking all these strategic thoughts and like reclining in their chair thinking how to deal with the next big threat or whatever it is, and or like what the next giant breakthrough will be. Whereas in fact most of your time is spent like this particular thing is broken and the person who is going to fix it like had to go home and now like you have to fix it, or like this investor has this question, you need to produce this document, and like it's just like it's the all these distractions one after another. Like I think basically the experience of doing a startup is just like dealing with distractions in serial. And I mean, sometimes the issues are actually huge, like you're trying to like close this round or this big deal, and there's some like recalcitrant investor or like stressful thing happening, or it's I don't know how to talk to this customer, or like whatever it is, but it really kind of spans the gamut. And I think, like to your question, like what are they actually good at? I think Paul and the other partners are really good at like just like getting that. I mean, they've done companies and they've seen this happen like literally thousands of times in other companies, and so whether the issue is like closing this round or doing this big deal or this acquisition or whatever, or it's just like how should the sign up button work? They have pretty good advice, and that's I mean that has made a big difference to Stripe.
Talk about just a little bit, and then we'll get back to Stripe. Talk a little bit about Paul Graham. You know Paul Graham probably as well as any of the YC founders do. What makes Paul Graham specifically so good? What makes him unique? And how has he helped you in your startups?
He kind of reminds me a bit of Peter Thiel, actually. He just makes these surprising connections and comes up with these like surprising ideas that that are things that I have not thought of. And I mean, like I guess I feel like lots of investors are sort of pretty good at the kind of quotidian things, like helping you close other deals, or you have a question at how should I grant options, or like what lawyer should I use? I mean, there are lots of investors that I think can give you pretty good advice there. Like usually I find the conversations that are most kind of useful with Paul are like thinking about some like totally new area or something, and go to Paul, and he just I come back with sort of 10 ideas that I had not thought of, and like some of them are really outlandish and like terrible ideas, and some of them are good. And I don't know. I think that like both Paul Graham and Peter Thiel sort of have this property where they sort of look at the world kind of sideways and just like see it slightly differently to everybody else. And I'm not sure if that's kind of an acquired thing, or that's a kind of a consequence of having seen so many other companies, or something they actually kind of explicitly put effort into or whatever. But regardless of sort of what it is, I think that's the thing that most strikes me about Paul.
Is there anything that he's not very good at?
Take
that as a no.
He's not very good at. He's not very good at sort of feigning interest in something that he doesn't care about, and so. If he'll get like really taken with like some particular thing that you could do with the business, and you'll be like, and then you'll move on to some other topic, and for example, say you're talking about like how you should issue options, and now you're like thinking about how you should issue options, and like Paul is sort of 10 minutes back in the conversation thinking, and you know what you should really do, and that's actually this like giant take over the world plan with some like path that you have never thought of. Yeah.
Great. So you launched 6 months ago, and tell us. So at this point, how big is the company? You guys were based down here. You've now moved to the city, but what it's more than just you and you and your brother. Actually, and the guy from 280 North joined your company, right?
That's right.
Your first customer actually joined your company.
Yes. Actually, several of our customers joined Stripe. So one of the things that turned out to be really nice about building kind of a service for their startups is that. You meet all these people who you like love to work with, and so we've repeatedly had the experience of like somebody builds something on top of Stripe, and sort of over the course of just them building on Stripe, we get the chance to sort of interact with them a lot, and we're just like really impressed, and building this business on top of Stripe is great, but we'd love to to have you actually just like build Stripe itself, and so. Now so I think we launched, we were 8 people or so. Now I think we're 23. And like, of say I think it was 8 that we were when we launched. I think that 4 or 5 were Stripe users, and so that's how we came across them. And I guess of the 20-something, the vast majority are engineers, and so mostly, I mean. When we launched, like I don't think Stripe is actually sort of like all that incredible an idea or anything, and I think it's kind of an idea that's been in the air for a while. It's just like finally who will make payments just like not really suck on the internet, and so I think that the reaction to Stripe to a large degree was like, oh great, payments now like don't suck anymore. And since we launched, it's very much been just like trying to keep up with the growth, where like it turns out there are all these people who want to use a payment service that doesn't suck. And so, just like there have been tons of sites like going live on Stripe every day, and mostly we've just been trying to keep up with that.
And so you grew 1 to 1,000 just based on word of mouth. How have you grown? Is it been the same? Have you guys?
It's all been word of mouth so far, or I mean word of mouth, or like people writing about us on blogs, or like the thing that we really like and is really kind of meaningful for us when it happens is sort of when people just like write about their experience of integrating Stripe, because I mean that's the goal. We just want to make it super simple for people to build a business on the web, and like that is the thing we're kind of always asking ourselves, like how could we make it easier for somebody to start building a business on the internet, and yeah, we've done no marketing so far, or actually we started like running some limited ads on like Stack Overflow and stuff like a week ago, but up to that it was all either word of mouth or stuff that our users wrote about Stripe. And again, I think that's we sort of intentionally held off marketing for a long time, because again, it's sort of that forcing function again. Like if our users aren't talking about Stripe, well, I mean, then we should make Stripe more awesome, like until they do. And I think that sort of like marketing and like sales teams and all that kind of stuff, they can be sort of really useful kind of accelerants when you're really confident that you have the product right. But I think that I think that I came across this quote, I think it was yesterday, from Eugene Kleiner about like how even turkeys can fly in a high wind. And I think there's kind of something like that for startups, where like, you know, with enough sales and marketing, you can make even like a really crappy product successful. And so I think we're sort of, but by not doing any marketing for a long time, it's, you know, making sure that we're like not this like hapless floundering turkey. And so I mean now I guess we've some nice at least suggestive evidence that, you know, people like the product and stuff, and so, you know, now we're much more okay with sort of, like, I guess there's two sides to it. Like on the one hand, you want to make sure you're not a turkey, but then when you're like, okay, I'm not a turkey, the other trap I think that you can fall into is, I think a lot of engineers, and I mean I see this trait in myself, kind of have this sort of I don't know, like this solipsism or kind of this kind of self-centeredness or something where like I'm going to build my beautiful code, you know, over here in the corner, and like I'll wait for the world to discover me, and yeah, I'm just going to focus on all these technical problems. Because I think you really have to go and like engage with the world and like talk to people and like tell them about what you're doing and why it's meaningful and everything. And yeah, you don't want to do that sort of, or like there is some value I think in holding off doing that initially, or just like not kind of pushing it too hard, because it's really nice to sort of to wait till it gets to the point where people will actually sort of discover you. But once you've got to that point and like you think that you actually have the thing, then I think you should go and tell the world and like really bring it to people. And so I think that, you know, over the coming years we'll try to do that more. But I think there's some value in holding off for a while.
So you're currently in how many countries are you in? Which countries are you in?
Well, so you can look at it in two ways. So if you have a Visa or like MasterCard or whatever branded credit card, it will work with a Stripe user. So we have like purchasers from, you know, almost every country in the world. However, if you want to accept payments with Stripe and like sign up with Stripe, you have to be based in the US today. And that is like the biggest bug with Stripe right now, in that, I mean, the whole promise of the internet is, you know, we'll break down borders and like there'll be this incredible, like shiny, you know, global real-time exchange of information. And sort of we're trying to sort of build a concomitant economic layer, but I mean, it's frankly just broken right now, and that like you can only accept payments if you happen to be sort of physically resident in the United States, and that makes no sense on the internet. And so we're working on fixing it. And I think that, so at least when we launched, I think that a majority of the people working at Stripe were born outside of the U.S. and like grew up not being U.S. citizens, and so.
But it was just you and your brother at the company, though, right?
Well, no. I mean, when we launched, and we were like whatever, 8 people or 9 or whatever it was. Like even then, there were like a ton of non-U.S. citizens.
Yeah.
Or people who at least didn't start out being U.S. citizens, and I mean, like the thing, like when you build a startup, I mean, you always care, like. You always want your mom to be able to use it, and like,
sure.
You know, whenever like I talk to my mom about Stripe, she's like, "Can I use Stripe yet?" I'm like, "No, mom." And so yeah, I mean
you're working on it.
We're working on it. I think,
yeah.
You know, even now.
You have a big announcement here, right? Exclusive.
I wish.
Oh, dang it.
I think now at 20-something people, Stripe is still like 50% non-US, and so
you're cranking on it.
We feel this bug pretty acutely.
Yeah. So we will get to the audience's questions here in just a minute. I just want to ask you one more thing. You know, Paul talks a lot about going after real problems, difficult problems, and I reached out to your younger, soon-to-be very, very famous brother, Tommy, and he's 16, and I got this email back from him, and I leaned over to Russ, who's sitting across from me, and just said, "Geez, I want this guy to write my obituary like today. He's just amazing." You know, he wrote this. I was like, "So tell me something. What makes Patrick unique?" And it really feeds into this. And he just said,
"Oh Christ."
Yeah. I'm reading it. Patrick is a son. No. He basically said, "You have a unique outlook on life that very little is truly impossible." And it's deep. It's really, really deep. So I just.
You're probably sleep deprived or something.
Yeah. You know, speaking to an audience of entrepreneurs and founders who, you know, like myself, you know, I've built mobile games and social apps and all that stuff. Like, where does the motivation come, or how do you start to work on a really, really hard problem, and when it, and how do you keep at it? Because you've obviously hit these very difficult steps along the way, and you guys have stayed with it.
Yeah. So I think that the biggest thing that I didn't realize about, quote unquote hard problems when I was starting out, is that they're harder in sort of like a specific way. In that, I mean, like you pick some giant challenge, like say it's fix healthcare, and I mean, just like fixing healthcare, I mean, it's really hard, isn't there? Are all these like obstacles and bureaucracies in your way, and it's not even clear how you should fix healthcare and all this stuff. But it's also like all these hard problems I think are actually easier in a way, which is that it's much easier to it's much easier to inspire other people to work with you, and it's much easier, I think, even to just like to inspire like yourself to work on this problem. In that sort of you wake up in the morning, and I mean, I don't want to pick any particular example because I think it's very easy to sort of wrongly denigrate things that look trivial. But I mean, if the thing is actually trivial, I mean, it's just sometimes you wonder like, why am I doing this? Is this really what I sort of thought of doing at whatever stage of my life? Whereas if you're doing something like really hard and really meaningful, I think that just on some kind of like metaphysical level makes it all easier. And you're trying to convince somebody that you really admire to work with you. And I mean, if you're working on something that actually is trivial, I mean, you're kind of faintly embarrassed, and like, you want to come work on my thing, but you can't really put your heart and soul into it. Whereas if you really are working on sort of something that your heart and soul is in fact in, then I think that makes it easier. And so I think that like people are pretty good at dealing with, I think, like kind of the sort of mechanical challenges of a hard problem, and the ones that like really cause you to lie awake at night are the for lack of a better term, like the metaphysical, philosophical ones or whatever. And I think that like working on hard problems, I mean, almost definitionally, solves at least that second class, in that you've picked the thing that you really think is meaningful. So I think actually hard problems is actually a bad term for it, because they're sort of like hard, easy problems. And yeah, I think that helps.
Great. Can we give Patrick a round of applause?
Thank you.
Let's take a couple of questions. Anybody have a question? And I'll just, Devin in the back, and I'll just repeat it.
So where did like Google in-app payments, like where did that like start coming about, and how did that play like with like competitive?
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. Say it again, Devin. Sorry.
Google in-app payments?
You mean like in the Chrome store or whatever?
Yeah, I guess in the Chrome store mostly. Like, and I don't know if they have like web stuff, but like where did that play like competitively, like when you were working on it?
So I mean, so I guess the question just around sort of Google payments and kind of how that relates to us in a competitive sense. So when we started out, I mean, turns out Stripe was not in fact the first online payments company. We realized pretty soon. So there was like this legacy industry of merchant accounts and gateways and sort of all that stuff. And there was obviously PayPal. Amazon had a payments product. Google had Google Checkout. This kind of, there always has been and probably will continue to be talk of like Facebook doing a payments thing. And so like basically every major technology company had like done a payments thing at some point. And so it was like a pretty crowded landscape. I think that like none of these companies, including Google, sort of really care about payments at their core. Like it's not core. It's like Google is not a payments company. It's a search company. And I think that like for anything, including payments, it's really hard to do anything really well. Sort of, I mean, if it's not your core focus. And I think, I mean, if you look at Google Checkout and just like look at it as a product, I mean, it's just not all that good a product. And to be honest, I don't even really fully understand why large organizations are sort of not capable of building good product in sort of areas they don't care about. I think payments, I think that sort of applies to almost anything. I think within, like another decent example is just like Quora versus Facebook questions. Like on paper, Facebook questions sort of crushed Quora, and I mean, obviously it didn't. I think with payments specifically, there's kind of a secondary aspect where the payments companies, it seems, need to be perceived as kind of neutral, and that the payments companies that have done well historically have not been those that sort of have their fingers in lots of pies and sort of have this weird kind of like platform layer to the payments aspect, but are also kind of somewhat competitive or whatever. And so, for example, I think Amazon Payments really has this challenge where, I mean, if you're like Walmart, for example, why would you use Amazon Payments and like send all this data to Amazon, who are also, I mean, your competitor? And so, I mean, Google has, let's say, less than Amazon, but I think there's that aspect there. And so I think that just, if you look historically, the payments companies that have done best have been those that have been kind of neutral. So, but I mean, ultimately, I guess it's a belief thing that we think that we can build a better payments product than Google. And I mean, I guess, you know, the future will tell if that's actually the case.
Anybody else? Yeah, go ahead,
Can you
Jack.
talk about your view on patents?
How does Stripe feel about patents?
I guess like almost everybody else in the industry, we're pretty opposed to software patents. I think that I think it's really well. I mean, the real problem with patents is is the kind of the game theory of it, where like kind of no matter what your belief on software patents are, you are severely disadvantaging yourself or like you, the company, by not pursuing software patents because kind of everyone else will, and it's sort of this arms race. And so I think that, and I think kind of to break that kind of equilibrium, we either need to change the law or just kind of change the structure in some clever way, like for example with what Twitter is doing. And I think that the Twitter, I mean, if you actually go read the legalese, I'm not convinced that the Twitter approach is actually sort of the right solution. That, for example, that allows offensive use of patents rather, even in cases where sort of the defendant is sort of just believed to be a future patent threat as opposed to somebody who's actually taken a lawsuit. But I'm actually pretty. There are lots of things I sort of despair about, but software patents aren't one of them, because I think that we're just kind of living in this stupid time right now where like, we're being kind of stupid about software patents, but I think it's actually a fairly, I think we'll fix it, and I think we'll fix it in within 5 years, because I think it's just pretty clear that software patents are a net bad idea, and I guess I don't think we're capable of fixing it like terribly quickly, but I think we'll get there. So.
Yeah, go ahead, Young.
Can you be a little bit more specific about what you do differently from PayPal? Because I think PayPal, you need for a merchant account to
Right.
accept the money,
Right.
right? So that thing you but also they have a bunch of APIs, and they need for developers. They have a PayPal conference, annual conference going
Yep.
for 3 days, right? So so it's for developers as well. So
Right.
can you be more specific about what you do different from PayPal?
So,
Sure.
so what specifically does Stripe do different from PayPal?
So it's a little bit hard to kind of answer that question directly, just because PayPal is sort of not this like one monolithic product, but it's sort of this like large, this large cluster of products flying in sort of loose formation. And so like the core PayPal product, when sort of people think about it, is this thing that appears in a website, and you click pay with PayPal, you go to the PayPal website, you enter your credentials there, and you sort of are whirled around in the PayPal vortex for a while, and then you like end up sort of
Hopefully end up back.
Yeah, right. And Stripe is better than that PayPal experience, because the checkout experience happens like right there on the page. It's like people building a site on the internet sort of want to have a payment experience that's sort of just as good as like the best sites on the internet. Like you want your payment forms to look just.
Well, it
as
feels
good
like
as
my
yours.
payment,
Right,
right? It
right,
feels like
right.
if it's my products on my website, it feels like it's my
Yes.
payment
Right.
process.
And you want to be able to sort of integrate it into the flow of your site sort of in a way that's natural and makes sense, and not have to like, throw people over onto these other websites and like hope they come back. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of, and I guess the other part of it is that you, with PayPal, kind of this is kind of adverse selection, kind of negative signaling problem, where you got to look a little bit more like a mom and pop or like smaller operation if you use PayPal, just because all the best companies insist on going and like getting a merchant account, and they're willing to invest the weeks that it takes to do that. And so we're sort of better than sort of that particular PayPal product, because we sort of provide the first class experience. But I mean, there are other PayPal products, and it's hard to kind of go through them one by one. But I think the kind of at a meta level, we feel that Stripe is a more compelling product than PayPal, because like not so much because it's sort of a feature list comparison, though we can do that feature list comparison. I think Stripe does very well in that, but just kind of at a like if you compare the iPhone and Android on like a feature checklist, that they look like basically the same product. And yet if you use an iPhone and an Android phone for 5 minutes, like it's night and day. Like they are just such different products and just have such radically different kind of quality of execution, and like it's, you know, and I think
User experience
I think
and
there are valid
everything.
reasons to choose Android, you know, things like the app review process and, you know, like all that stuff, but just like they're very different things. And I'm not claiming that sort of Stripe is iPhone and PayPal is the Android, but just kind of there's something philosophical in these products, the iPhone and the Android, that just like differ, and it's hard to sort of put your finger on exactly what it is, but it's there. And so with Stripe, we have a very firm belief about sort of like what this product is and how the payment should work. It should be a really simple API. It should be integrated onto your website. Everything should be really fast and beautiful and simple. And with PayPal, they have like tons of different products and different permutations and like different pricing schedules, and you know, the interface is a little bit dated and all these things. But like it's not one single thing that separates them. It's just kind of this you know, underlying philosophy. So I'm not sure that actually answers the question, but
Better comparison might be Stripe is like iPhone to PayPal, it's BlackBerry, kind of like that. That's kind of how I look at it. I mean, that's my 2 cents. Okay, yeah, go ahead. Ex-PayPal guy right here. So yeah, let's hear it.
There's a really interesting startup I read about called Shopify. It's enabling payments on Twitter.
yeah, I've heard of them.
What are your thoughts on that?
What are your thoughts on Chirpify?
Enabling payments on Twitter.
Enabling payments on Twitter, like Gumroad, kind of like that?
So I don't know Chirpify super well. I mean, I've looked at their website, but I'm not all that familiar with the product. But I think that no, I'm going to try to dodge the question. Instead, talk about the general concept here, mostly because I'm just not all that familiar with Chirpify. But sort of at a meta level, I guess Chirpify is sort of building kind of, or helping build or facilitate kind of more lightweight forms of commerce, in that, you know, commerce need not be sort of going to Amazon and putting a thing in your cart and basically like a recreation of a supermarket experience online, but it can be something sort of much more casual and just like, you know, buying something at a stand or something. And I think on a kind of on a philosophical level, that's a really promising direction, and that I think that sort of the internet of 10 years' time, when we have this sort of better economic foundation, whatever it looks like, it's not that sort of we'll be making much more sort of $300 purchases. It's that I think we'll be making much more casual purchases and just kind of giving value to way more people and just having a much lower kind of activation energy there. And to the extent that sort of Shopify is doing things like that by integrating it into Twitter, I think that is a really promising avenue. So I guess that's what I feel.
Yeah, go ahead.
One of the reasons why I don't have a PayPal account is because, you know, like the bad press,
Mhm.
essentially the customer experience, which is mostly related to fraud, right? So fraud is a hard problem to solve, and it's also a hard problem to solve at a scalable
Mhm.
way. So how are you going to convince your users that, like, you're not going to freeze their money, that you're going to deal with fraud, and they can trust you?
So what are some of the solutions that you have in place to deal with fraud?
Right. So I think this question is actually really interesting because kind of when people think of online payments, one of the first things they think of is fraud, because I mean everyone's kind of heard the horror stories from PayPal, and sort of like in how they almost went out of business, you know, because of the Russian mob and like all these crazy stories. And I think that a lot of the kind of the subtlety of the stories has been lost a little bit, in that, for example, with PayPal, even at the times of sort of their greatest losses, they actually had a pretty good idea of where the fraud was coming from and even how they could mitigate it. But they sort of made the determination, in hindsight correctly, that that they could afford the losses and the kind of additional growth that they got by sort of taking on these kind of somewhat suspect users. It was just worth it. And eventually they sort of got better at sort of detecting the fraud, and you know, it became less of a problem. And if you look at PayPal's fraud losses today, they're actually very low. I do think still that well, and alongside PayPal, then I mean, PayPal processes a very small fraction of all online transactions. Like the vast majority are processed by this kind of legacy infrastructure, again, of merchant accounts and gateways and everything else. And these companies, you know, they don't have these insanely brilliant sort of mathematicians and programmers and ML people and big data people sort of curating these models. I mean, they apply a fairly simplistic approach to fraud, and just turns out that actually works. And so I think that, I mean, fraud is just not the kind of existentially challenging problem for an online payments company that people tend to kind of extrapolate from the PayPal experience to assume that it is. I do think I think one of the mistakes that PayPal's made on fraud is that they just don't. Like I feel like they look at it sort of from a very mathematical standpoint, and they sort of think, oh well, if I shut down this user, there is X probability that I'm wrong, that they're a false positive, and like the loss in that case of making an incorrect decision is the loss of the sort of the profit that I make on this user. Whereas of course that's not the loss. The loss that you make is the giant reputational hit from somebody talking about PayPal and telling their friends and like sharing this experience of how PayPal like literally in many cases took away their livelihood. And I think that that sort of short-sighted or like miscalibrated mathematical model is actually a very dangerous way to model fraud. And so we're really conscious of that at Stripe, and I think that we can do some things to just sort of convince users that we're trustworthy and safe and everything else, and we're audited to the most stringent sort of security levels possible, and we've hired people from other companies who have spent tons of time dealing with fraud and know the industry really well and this kind of stuff. But I think ultimately what it boils down to is we do not intend to have these stories appear of like how Stripe took away my livelihood, and I think that like. A lot of it comes down to that, and that we simply we're not willing to make those mistakes, and that we're not willing to look at sort of an individual user's loss as being the loss of that profit. I think it's much larger than that. But yeah, I guess coupled with that, I guess very sort of emphatic view of the downside of being wrong on fraud. The slightly more encouraging side is that it's pretty hard, but it's not quite as hard as I think everyone assumes. So hopefully we'll do okay.
Great. Can we give Patrick a big round of applause?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Neil.